Well, good evening. As you can probably tell, I'm shooting this a little bit earlier in the day, but welcome to another Ask Pastor Paul. And, or I guess another Pastor Paul's Picks, whichever one you want to make it. This is a Pastor Paul's Picks, I guess. Unless somebody was to ask me what book would I recommend to people who are seeking to understand the Christian faith, and who would I recommend they read who have very inquiring minds. And so that's what we're going to look at this evening. I'm actually going to talk about my pick, and then basically put him within the context of sort of where he lined up in my faith and how I think he can be valuable to you and to your efforts as you try to reach people who have questions, who are sort of keen thinkers, who want to understand, or who have many doubts, or have bought into some of the doubts or some of the questions about faith that our culture has put forward and need answers to those questions, and are willing to read, and are maybe people that you don't have all the answers for. That's a situation that we commonly get into, is we have friends who ask good questions, fair questions, and we want to be able to provide them with answers, but don't necessarily have the perfect words to say them, because that's not our gifting. And so we want to put them in a certain direction. And so this evening, the direction that I would recommend that you send people is to Timothy Keller. And so I've got a couple of his books here. And I'm wondering if that's mirrored. I might have to go through and fix this. But The Reason for God is one of his early books that is very popular and deals with skeptics and people who have questions about the faith. Then he's recently written another book called Making Sense of God, and he says that this is actually the book that would come first, really. It's at a more foundational level than The Reason for God. The Reason for God already makes a whole bunch of assumptions about our culture and about who we are and the way we think, and our epistemology, which is the way that we learn and how we know things. And so it's not that it's a bad book. The Reason for God is a great book, but The Reason for God operates at sort of North American assumptions, whereas this book goes even deeper to more foundational issues of secularism and philosophy and faith, and why we believe what we believe, and things that we take for granted or that we just assume. Anyway, so it's I won't even say it's a better book. It's a great book as well. That's a great companion. So it's Making Sense of God and The Reason for God. And I was going to show a Tim Keller message. He's a nice blend of teacher and pastor. He's sort of professorial, if that's a word, and has a very distinct way of teaching, almost always in 3 points, breaking the text down very clearly. And so if you look up Timothy Keller online, you can see a lot of his stuff. But just to be a little bit different today, I thought that I would actually read a chapter of The Reason for God. And so Timothy Keller came along in my life at a time when I had basically answered almost all of the apologetic questions that I had, and answered them for many of my friends. However, reading Timothy Keller was refreshing because he affirmed what I had landed on myself, which in and of itself is kind of refreshing and lets us know that we're going in the right direction. When you rigorously think through something and arrive at conclusions that come from your human experience and from your study of human nature and philosophy and previous thinkers, and you arrive at certain conclusions based on what you feel is reasonable, and at the same time based on what you experience and faith, and then you run into another good thinker who arrives at the same conclusions that you did, that's affirming that you're on the right track. And then, as obviously in the Christian faith and the church, that's what we experience, is that there is a whole body of believers who have arrived at the same conclusion, and who experience the same things, and who understand life through the same lens. and have had the same experiences that supersede what we can explain easily, so to speak, or naturally. And so Making Sense of God is the book to start with in terms of those foundational things, and then The Reason for God is arguments and apologetics that you can make. So Timothy Keller came along at a point in my life when it was just affirming to hear, again, a thoughtful, critical thinker arrive at conclusions that were similar to mine, and then secondarily to state the arguments or to unpack them in ways that are even more elegant by a long shot than I would have unpacked them or explained them. And so the great thing about Timothy Keller is he penetrates through fairly simply to the reasons for God and to the errors and pitfalls in secular thinking, and exposes them for what they are. Not in a mean way, but in a gracious way. Apologetics. Nobody gets argued into the kingdom of heaven, but people still need their questions answered. And so apologetics are not meant to be anything except gracious, and to provide information and to provide alternative ways of thinking, because we can get locked into very rigid ways of thinking. We hear things enough, whether it's at school or whether it's from our family or whether it's from our friends or whether it's just from the general culture. We hear things enough and we can get locked into our thinking. And a big part of what apologetics is, and a big part of what evangelism is simply shifting the ground underneath all of our feet to make sure that we think about things differently and not just accept what has been told us. So I'm going to read one chapter of The Reason for God, and I'm actually going to read chapter 1. And so you can just see whether it's something that might resonate with you or something that might resonate with your friends. And chapter 1 deals with one of those things that is just sort of those assumed truths that the world takes for granted, but maybe isn't as obvious as they think. And I was going to read the first chapter, but it's a little bit long. And not too long, but I don't want to keep you sitting here for 20 or 25 minutes listening to me drone on. I'm going to take one part out of chapter 1. And in this section, Tim Keller is talking about whether we should condemn religion or not. And he uses 4 axioms, or 4 things that are restated by society over and over and over again. All major religions are equally valid and basically teach the same thing. Each religion sees part of spiritual truth, but none can see the whole truth. Religious belief is too culturally and historically conditioned to be the truth, and it is arrogant to insist your religion is right and convert others to it. And so he takes each of these 4 in this few pages here, and he basically unpacks them and shows why these 4 very common arguments about or against religion fall apart under the weight of their own assertion. And so you can't assert these things without ultimately disproving yourself. And so I'm just going to maybe not read the whole chapter, but I'm just going to jump in and just read the section on how Timothy Keller responds to these 4 assertions that are very common in our secular society today. Religion is not going away, and its power cannot be diminished by government control. But can't we, via education and argument, find ways to socially discourage religions that claim to have the truth and that try to convert others to their beliefs? Couldn't we find ways to urge all of our citizens, whatever their religious beliefs, to admit that each religion or faith is just one of many equally valid paths to God and the ways to live in the world? This approach creates an environment in which it is considered unenlightened and outrageous to make exclusive religious claims, even in personal conversations. It does so by stating and restating certain axioms that eventually achieve the status of common sense. Those who deviate from them are stigmatized as foolish or dangerous. Unlike the first strategy, this approach to the divisiveness of religion is having some effect. It cannot ultimately succeed, however, because at its heart is a fatal inconsistency, even perhaps a hypocrisy, that will eventually lead to the collapse of this way of thinking. What follows are several of these axioms and the problems with each. The axiom, all major religions are equally valid and basically teach the same thing. This assertion is so common that one journalist recently wrote that anyone who believed that there are inferior religions is a right-wing extremist. Do we really want to say that the Branch Davidians, or religions requiring child sacrifice, are not inferior to any other faith? The great majority of people would almost certainly agree that they are. Most people who assert the equality of religions have in mind the major world faiths, not splinter sects. This was the form of the objection I got from the student the night I was on the panel. He contended that doctrinal differences between Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, and Hinduism were superficial and insignificant, that they all believed in the same God. But when I asked him who that God was, he described him as an all-loving spirit in the universe. The problem with this position is its inconsistency. It insists that doctrine is unimportant, but at the same time assumes doctrinal beliefs about the nature of God that are at loggerheads with those of all the major faith. Buddhism doesn't believe in a personal God at all. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam believe in a God who holds people accountable for their beliefs and practices and whose attributes could not all be reduced to love. Ironically, the insistence that the doctrines do not really matter is really a doctrine itself. It holds a specific view of God which is touted as superior and more enlightened than the beliefs of most major religions, so the proponents of this view do the very thing they forbid in others. Each religion sees part of spiritual truth, but none can see the whole truth. Sometimes this point is illustrated with the story of the blind man and the elephant. Several blind men were walking along and came upon an elephant that allowed them to touch and feel it. "This creature is long and flexible like a snake," said the first blind man, holding the elephant's trunk. "Not at all. It is thick and round like a tree trunk," said the second blind man, feeling the elephant's leg. "No, it is large and flat," said the third blind man, touching the elephant's side. Each blind man could feel only part of the elephant, and none could envision the entire elephant. In the same way, it is argued the religions of the world each have a grasp on part of the truth about spiritual reality, but none can see the whole elephant or claim to have a comprehensive vision of that truth. This illustration backfires on its users. The story is told from the point of view of someone who is not blind. How could you know that each blind man only sees part of the elephant unless you claim to be able to see the whole elephant? There is an appearance of humility in the protestation that the truth is much greater than any one of us can grasp. But if this is used to invalidate all other claims to discern the truth, it is in fact an argument to claim a kind of knowledge which is superior to all others. We have to ask, what is the absolute vantage ground from which to claim to be able to relativize all the absolute claims of these different scriptures make? How could you possibly know that no religion can see the whole truth unless you yourself have the superior, comprehensive knowledge of spiritual reality you just claimed that none of the religions can have? Third axiom. Religious belief is too culturally and historically conditioned to be truth. When I first came to New York City nearly 20 years ago, I more often heard this objection that all religions are equally true. Now, however, I am more likely to be told that all religions are equally false. The objection goes like this: all moral and spiritual claims that are the product of our particular historical and cultural moment, and therefore no one should claim they can know the truth, since no one can judge whether one assertion about spiritual and moral reality is truer than another. The sociologist Peter L. Berger reveals the serious inconsistency of this common assumption. In his book, A Rumor of Angels, Berger recounts how the 20th century had uncovered the sociology of knowledge, namely that people believe what they do largely because they are socially conditioned to do so. We like to think that we think for ourselves, but it is not that simple. We think like the people we most admire and need. Everyone belongs to a community that reinforces the plausibility of some beliefs and discourages others. Berger notes that many have concluded from this fact that because we are all locked into our historical and cultural locations, it is impossible to judge the rightness or wrongness of competing beliefs. Berger goes on, however, to point out that absolute relativism can only exist if the relativists exempt themselves from their own razor. If you infer from the social conditionedness of all belief that no belief can be held as universally true for everyone, that itself is a comprehensive claim about everyone that is the product of social conditions, so it cannot be true on its own terms. Relativity relativizes itself, says Berger, so we can't have relativism all the way down. Our cultural biases make weighing competing truth claims harder, yes. The social conditionedness of belief is a fact, but it cannot be used to argue that all truth is completely relative, or else the very argument refutes itself. Berger concludes that we cannot avoid weighing spiritual and religious claims by hiding behind the cliche that there's no way to know the truth. We must still do the hard work of asking which affirmations about God, human nature, and spiritual reality are true and which are false. We will have to base our life on some answer to that question. The philosopher Alvin has his own version of Berger's argument. People often say to him, If you were born in Morocco, you wouldn't even be a Christian, but rather a Muslim. And he responds, suppose we concede that if I had been born of Muslim parents in Morocco rather than Christian parents in Michigan, my beliefs would have been quite different. But the same goes for the pluralist. If the pluralist had been born in Morocco, he probably wouldn't be a pluralist. Does it follow that his pluralist beliefs are produced in him by an unreliable belief-producing process? Plantinga and Berger make the same point. You can't say all claims about religions are historically conditioned except the one I'm making right now. If you insist that no one can determine which beliefs are right and wrong, why should we believe what you're saying? The reality is that we can make truth claims of some sort, and it is very hard to weigh them responsibly, but we have no alternative but to try to do so. Fourth axiom. It is arrogant to insist your religion is right and to convert others to it. The noted religion scholar John Hick has written that once you become aware that there are many other equally intelligent and good people in the world who hold different beliefs from you, and that you will not be able to convince them otherwise, then it is arrogant for you to continue to try to convert them or to hold your view to be the superior truth. Once again, there is an inherent contradiction. Most people in the world don't hold to John Hick's view that all religions are equally valid, and many of them are equally as good and intelligent as he, and unlikely to change their views. That would make the statement, all religious claims to have a better view of things are arrogant and wrong, to be, on its own terms, arrogant and wrong. Many say that it is ethnocentric to claim that your religion is superior to others. Yet isn't that very statement ethnocentric? Most non-Western cultures have no problem saying that their culture and religion is best. The idea that it is wrong to do so is deeply rooted in Western traditions of self-criticism and individualism. To charge others with the sin of ethnocentrism is really a way of saying our culture's approach to other cultures is superior to yours. We are then doing the very thing we forbid others to do. The historian C. John Somerville has pointed out that a religion can be judged only on the basis of another religion. You cannot evaluate a religion except on the basis of some ethical criteria that in the end amounts to your own religious stance. By now, the fatal flaw in this approach to religion in general and to Christianity in particular should be obvious. Skeptics believe that any exclusive claims to superior knowledge of spiritual reality cannot be true, but this objection is itself a religious belief. It assumes God is unknowable, or that God is loving but not wrathful, or that God is an impersonal force rather than a person who speaks in Scripture. All of these are unprovable faith assumptions. In addition, their proponents believe that they have a superior way to view things. They believe the world would be a better place if everyone dropped the traditional religious views of God and truth and adopted theirs. Therefore, their view is also an exclusive claim about the nature of spiritual reality. If all such views are to be discouraged, this one should be as well. If it is not narrow to hold this view, then there is nothing inherently narrow about holding to traditional religious beliefs. Mark Lilla, a professor at the University of Chicago, spoke to a bright young student at Wharton Business School, who, to Lilla's bafflement, had gone forward at a Billy Graham crusade to give his life to Christ. Lilla writes, I wanted to cast doubt on the step he was about to take, to help him see that there are other ways to live, other ways to seek knowledge, love, even self-transformation. I wanted to convince him his dignity depended on maintaining a free, skeptical attitude towards doctrine. I wanted to save him. Doubt, like faith, has to be learned. It is a skill. But the curious thing about skepticism is that its adherents, ancient and modern, have so often been proselytizers. In reading them, I've often wanted to ask, why do you care? Their skepticism offers no good answer to that question, and I don't have one for myself. Lilly's wise self-knowledge reveals his doubts about Christianity to be a learned alternate faith. He believes that the individual's dignity as a human rests on doctrinal skepticism, which is, of course, an article of faith. As he admits, he cannot avoid believing that it would be better for people if they adopted his beliefs about reality and human dignity rather than Billy Graham's. It is no more narrow to claim that one religion is right than to claim that one way to think about all religions, namely that all are equal, is right. We are all exclusive in our beliefs about religion, but in different ways. There's one more, keeping religion completely private, and then a summary of the chapter, but I'm actually going to just end it there. But hopefully just by that, those four sort of things that people believe, and his answers to them, you get to see a bit of the way that Timothy Keller thinks and the way that he writes, and how he does it in very summary fashion and helpful fashion to just help us unpack arguments and see them for what they really are. And so I hope that you will pick up Timothy Keller, and that you will maybe recommend his books to friends. The nice thing about Timothy Keller is that he's kind of a modern day C.S. Lewis. He's a C.S. Lewis for postmoderns. C.S. Lewis wrote at a time when most thinking was what was called modern. It was objective truth. That was the reality of moderns and modern thinking. And as you've probably heard many times, the term postmodernism came along in the 80s and late 70s, 80s, and 90s. And postmodernism basically deals with relativistic truth. And so C.S. Lewis is great, and you can recommend C.S. Lewis. But Timothy Keller is kind of like a C.S. Lewis for postmoderns. He answers a lot of their questions in a way that a postmodern would really have to grapple with. So that's Pastor Paul's Picks for this week, and hopefully you guys have a great night and pick up Tim Keller. He's thought-provoking, but accessible at the same time. God bless you guys.